Maria Koomen. I lead the Open Governance Network for Europe, which is a joint initiative of the Open Government Partnership and Democratic Society, which aims to drive connection, dialogue, and learning around civic participation, transparency, and accountability, with the aim of helping improve democracy and governance in and across the European Union. And today is International Democracy Day. Happy International Democracy Day. It's an important day to celebrate democracy, and in our case, to help reflect on the state of our democracies around the world. To mark this occasion, every year, 5 Brussels-based democracy support organizations come together to host a special conference. And this year's conference is organized by the European Network of Political Foundations, the European Endowment for Democracy, International IDEA, Carnegie Europe, and the European Partnership for Democracy, with support from their members, such as the Club of Madrid. This morning, there was already an important discussion on Afghanistan, on the lessons learned and what they mean for the future of democracy support. And a recording of this session will be online next week. This year's conference theme is Partnerships for Supporting Democracy. After a decade of democratic decline, through shortcomings in political and economic governance fueling polarization, the exploitation of identity politics, the rise of illiberal actors, countries around the world are stepping up and stepping out to strengthen cooperation for better democracies at home and abroad. With international forums like the Summit for Democracy proposed by US President Joe Biden, we have a rare opportunity this year to address the urgent dilemmas facing our democracy policies in our current troubled landscape internationally. But summits and speeches may not be enough. We must use this opportunity to leverage international cooperation among like-minded partners and partnership-based forums like the Open Government Partnership to make these efforts and summits successful, to turn speeches into strategy and action. And now, I'm thrilled to help kick off this year's International Democracy Day conference with an important discussion on the theme of this year's conference, Stronger Together, Partnerships for Supporting Democracy. In this discussion, we're going to reflect on ongoing cooperation between transatlantic and global actors. We'll share experiences and opportunities for multilateral partnership that can help restore and also rejuvenate democracies, both abroad and at home. And looking forward, we will explore what inclusive commitments for the future of democracy should look like and how partnerships can help make them happen. I am honored to be joined here by 3 distinguished leaders from the global North and South who are crucial for such global cooperation. To introduce Mr. Eamon Gilmore, who is the EU Special Representative for Human Rights and the Special Envoy for the Colombian Peace Process. Formerly, he was Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. Also, we have Undersecretary Uzra Zeya, who is the US Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights under President Biden's administration. She also has a distinguished 27-year career in the US Foreign Service. And also with us today, we have former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She's the former president of Liberia from 2006 to 2018, and notably the first democratically elected female head of state in Africa. She's a leading promoter of peace and justice, women's empowerment, and democracy, a work for which she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. Before we jump into our discussion, a quick note about what to expect in this session. I'm delighted to moderate a Q&A among our speakers, and then we look to you, our audience, to join us in this discussion. I invite you to use Slido to share your questions and all your comments, and a Slido link and code are here in the YouTube description below, and our hosts can drop them in the YouTube chat. I'll bring as many of your questions into the discussion as I can. So without further ado, I'd like to kick us off. And perhaps we can start with you, Mr. Gilmore. In your view, what has been the most definitive factor driving the EU's global agenda in the last 2 years?
Well, in the last 2 years, it has to be, of course, the COVID crisis, which has reminded us about how interdependent we all are and how to address major crises like these we need to work together, particularly in the multilateral sphere, and how it turned out that multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization are so important to us. Certainly, the COVID crisis has driven the Team Europe approach that the European Union has taken to its global agenda over the course of the past 2 years. And of course, it has fundamentally changed the way in which we are doing a lot of our work. But hopefully the COVID crisis is very much an exception. And I think if we look more generally at what is influencing European Union's action on the global stage, I think there are a number of factors. We can include climate, technology, geopolitics, and certainly very high among the factors are the challenges which are facing democracy, human rights, and the rule of law at many levels. Now that matters to the European Union because these are the values that the European Union is founded on. Right at the very beginning of the European Union treaties, in Article 2, there is a requirement that all member states of the European Union must comply with their obligations to democracy, human rights, and rule of law. It's a condition of membership of the European Union that countries reach these standards, but not just to comply with those standards. There's also a requirement in the treaties that the 27 member states of the European Union, individually and collectively as the European Union, work to promote those values, and therefore they are reflected in the foreign policy and security policy of the European Union. And you will find that documented in the Global Strategy in 2016, in the book that High Representative Josep Borrell published at the beginning of this year on European Union's foreign policy, in the Council conclusions in 2019 on democracy, on the European Union's action plan on human rights and democracy, which was adopted unanimously by the 27 member states at the end of 2020, on the internal European democracy plan, which complements that, and also on the gender plans and statements on multilateralism. So it's also important to us because we are, of course, seeing, and you've mentioned it, these setbacks to democracy that we have seen over the course of the past decade. I was struck by the report of VDEM, which tracks the health of democracy in the world year by year. And in its report at the beginning of 2021, it tells us quite dramatically that 68% of the world's population now live in autocracies, either of the absolute autocratic kind that we are familiar with, but also what they describe as electoral autocracies. Now, we might take issue with some of the definitions and some of the inclusions in that report, but nevertheless, the trend is very clear. And in another measurement that they used, which is the level of democratic freedoms that are enjoyed by what they call the average European citizen. And let me say again, I'm a little skeptical with some of these type of measurements, but it's interesting because what they say is that that level of democratic freedom that's enjoyed across the world is back down to where it was 30 years ago at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So some of the optimistic predictions of Francis Fukuyama and others that it was the end of history and liberal democracy had triumphed, unfortunately, has not quite stood the test of time. And at a practical level, of course, we're seeing that. Afghanistan is the most recent example of it, where women are being driven back into a medieval environment. Belarus last year, 650 political prisoners as we speak who dared to challenge the Lukashenko regime. The coup in Myanmar earlier this year. Ethiopia, what's happening in Tigray. One of the first country visits that I did in this capacity was a visit to Ethiopia in 2019, and there was just so much hope at that time, and it's tragic to see what has happened in the meantime. So looking at how we address that, the European Union has been doing a number of things, specifically on free and fair elections. We've been doing quite a lot of election monitoring. over the course of the last 2 decades, I think over 200 full electoral observation missions working with partner countries. Even during the COVID crisis, we managed to get election observation missions in 2020 in Guyana, in Peru, in Ghana, and this year in Zambia. We've also done expert missions where electoral experts go and work with countries, over 100 of those. And just looking at the list here, it's quite a long list, but it includes Bolivia, Burkina Faso, Jordan, Niger, several others. We've also developed a methodology to observe the online aspects of elections, and that's been piloted in Tunisia and Sri Lanka and Peru. And of course, we've been providing a considerable amount of financial support for democracy, around 100 million a year for democratic institutions and civil society and press freedom. That, I think, has to be seen in the broader context of the supports we provide in the broader human rights area, 1.5 billion in the financial framework up to 2027, the implementation of the action plan on human rights and democracy through country strategy in each individual country that we have been developing, and we'll be working with partners. It will inform the human rights dialogue, the political and diplomatic engagement that we have with countries and with regions. Some of those, for example, that I will be personally involved with over the next number of months will include human rights dialogues with the African Union, with countries in Central Asia and in Latin America. And of course, we're backing that up with what we do at home, because what we do externally, I think, is only credible insofar as we do it at home. So we have a European democracy plan, which relates to elections, uses of technology. We've had what we call the rule of law mechanism, with requirements that there is a rule of law report on each individual member state. And as you know, the European Commission has also launched legal proceedings against 2 member states for infringements. Just today, President von der Leyen, in her State of the Union address to the European Parliament, put a very big emphasis on action on democracy. And in the months ahead, we will be seeing the Commission rolling out proposals for legislation on political advertising, on revising the rules on the financing of European political parties, on a new operational EU mechanism to support resilient electoral processes, on measures in particular to support and enhance the safety of journalists. So on this International Day for Democracy and this very important event, which I'm delighted to join, it's a case, I think, of saying we are very exercised by what is happening to democracy and the challenges that are facing it. But we're on the case, we're working on it, we are doing a lot, and we know we have a lot more to do.
Thanks, Eamon. I appreciate the really comprehensive view of what's driving the EU's global agenda, and also the fact that the EU's global agenda does include a view of what's happening at home. And all of these factors you mentioned driving these agendas are exacerbated by the pandemic, as you mentioned, for the good and for the bad. And it's incredible to hear in such a short summary, really the action that's packed into this agenda. Now, moving on to the US. I mean, Eamon has described the incredible impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while we've seen the pandemic has been disastrous for many countries across the world, including the US, under Secretary Zeya, I'd like to ask you, what kind of opportunities has the pandemic presented for the US foreign policy agenda when it comes to multilateral engagement?
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, Eamon, for such a comprehensive presentation of the EU's democracy and human rights priorities. With respect to COVID-19, the immense global challenges posed by the pandemic, by definition, have necessitated a global and a multilateral response. And I think we've seen from day one, the Biden-Harris administration has re-engaged with the World Health Organization and other members of the international community to combat this threat. The United States has also reinvigorated our engagement in multilateral and multi-stakeholder fora with our European allies, with the G7, with the Freedom Online Coalition, the Community of Democracies, the Global Action on Disability Network, and the Open Government Partnership, which I know you've done such important work for, Maria. And all of this work is intended to encourage and build greater momentums for governments to ensure democratic responses to the COVID-19 crisis. For example, in the G7 in June, the United States joined its partners in Cornwall who shared this determination to beat COVID-19 and build back better, animated and driven by the values which unite all of us. We gathered in Cornwall, united by the principle that shared beliefs and shared responsibilities are the bedrock of leadership and prosperity, and we agreed to a robust multilateral agenda for global action. Now, a key part of that agenda is advancing respect for human rights and transparency as absolutely necessary parts of the solution to public health crises. Unfortunately, we've seen some governments engage in COVID-related disinformation or use the pandemic to rationalize crackdowns on human rights and fundamental freedoms, expanded use of surveillance tools, and targeting of vulnerable groups, including LGBTQI+ persons. We also remain deeply concerned about the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence and other increased risks facing women and girls as a result of the pandemic. We believe that government responses to COVID-19 should not be used as an excuse to silence, target, or harass civil society or others wishing to contribute to public discussions and hold their governments accountable. So for all these reasons, the United States will continue to work with our international partners to promote and protect civil society and ensure that it has the support it needs to survive and thrive in the face of this overwhelming pandemic and new restrictions and threats. Finally, the United States will address the pandemic's lasting effects by working to improve our and the world's preparedness for the next one. This requires, among other things, promoting transparency, accountability, and respect for fundamental freedoms as vital for resilient and healthy democratic societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Undersecretary, and also for showing how fundamental rights and democratic principles are underpinning US foreign policy, as Eamon has with EU global agenda. Now, I would like to stay on the pandemic theme, if I may. One more question, moving on to former President Sirleaf. Former President, I'd like to ask you about some key trends. So what are the key trends that you have observed over the last 2 years in terms of multilateral cooperation?
Let me start off. First of all, let me say thank you to Eamon and to Zeya for their very perspective comments. I start by saying, in our troubled environment of today's world, do we see a trend? There's so many complications, contradictions, that we don't know if we have something that we can say, yes, it's moving in this direction, and we can accept acceleration, toward that. But that said, clearly, democracy is under threat. And I think that's been mentioned by Eamon and all. And we see that manifested in certain ways that one could say ultimately maybe trend-setting. The emergence of sovereignty Whereas below, through the United Nations, the European Union, the coming together for coordinated collective responses to global issues, decisions were taken in this kind of unity. More recently, and I may use COVID-19 and some of that, we see where people are stressing that we're not going to have responses that do not reflect our own issues based upon our sovereignty. And so while we've been trying to get, for example, as co-chair of the independent panel for pandemic preparedness response, we've tried to get some changes in institutions. But getting that, we have people say, no, we can't do this as long as we respect our sovereignty. And that sovereignty issue also comes on the back of what I call a return to a geopolitical rivalry. And that rivalry, you can see it manifested through trade wars. You can see it manifested itself through, again, the vaccine issues, relating to COVID-19, whereas you need a unified response through vaccines. Many countries, of course, that have manufacturing capabilities have every right to do their vaccines. But then being able to get the vaccines to the needed, particularly in the poor and low-income countries, then we see a rivalry because everyone wants to make sure that they get their vaccines to those countries. And the countries are placed in a difficult position because they need the vaccine as quickly as possible when their populations are at risk and are dying. And then that rivalry shows itself. So how do we again try to bring back the unity? Africa in Africa, sensing all of this, has said, well, look, what we want is to make sure you bring manufacturing back to our shores so we don't have to face these rivalries and whatnot. We wanted manufacturers, so we want to make sure whether the World Trade Organization is going to allow licensing or going to leave the property rights and all of that. So, and because of this, they're having effect on democracy in the effect of the rise of authoritarianism. We see this in Africa right now, whereas before the Africa agenda has always been one of promoting democracy, despite the fact that we have authoritarianism that has been with us for some time in certain leaders that have stayed in power very long. But the majority of us, in keeping with what is the African Union protocol and commitment in charter, is that we would promote democracy, we would promote inclusive democracy. We would. And so today, when we find again people retreating into nationalism, protectionism on a basis of self-interest, and doing this through authoritarian means, we have seen again, it was mentioned by Eamon about in Africa, something we've tried to think we were moving away from that. We've had about 4 attempted coup d'etats just in the last year. African Union is battling with that to bring democracy back, something that we have all been committed to. We look at, I reflect on Kofi Annan and the responsibility to protect, something all nations are committed to. If nations themselves are infringing on the rights of their people, that as a unified body, the United Nations had a right to protect them from this. That's so difficult to get now because many countries are asserting these sovereignties and their own rights. And so these are all what I call maybe the bad sides of democracy, because democracy also lends itself to choice, not only electoral choice, but choice in national agenda, choice in then those are the offsides. And but it also, in the case of Africa, we say it brings a good side also. And that good side is national ownership. So our own countries now say we have the right to determine our own future. We have the right, to determine our priorities and our self-interest. And that's a good thing because it means stronger commitment, stronger allocation of resources to the agenda set by ourselves through our own people's determination. And so we must find a way to keep that alive, but at the same time, ensuring that it can only succeed if it succeeds with inclusion, if it succeeds with the protection of human rights, if it succeeds in such a way that ownership manifests itself to be able to promote development, to be able to make sure that prosperity replaces poverty. And so that's why as we move toward trying to find what is this new world agenda, how are we going to so reshape institutions of the world around a new agenda that provides ownership, but provides ownership of choice in such a way that choice is for the betterment of people, and that we can see that coming out of COVID-19, that's what the whole COVID-19 or dialogue is all about, that we will work together to be able, first of all, to stop the pandemic through prevention, through collective action, in ensuring that supplies and vaccines reach everyone in an equitable way. And we're going to address the overall question of gender inequity, injustices, as all have been exacerbated, during COVID-19. Our challenge and the partnership, European partnership, and all the challenge will be, how do we bring ourselves back together in such a way that first we stop the pandemic, secondly, we go back to trying to achieve the sustainable development goals that have been affected because of all of this drifting away from this consolidated, unified global agenda to which we were all committed. And in a few years, we've seen a lot of distancing from this that has created a confused world today. So we're all trying to find our way. And I hope the collective effort of all of us in all the areas in which we serve will help us all to find that path toward a return to what can lead to a better world. Thank you.
A very positive note after a very sober assessment of the key trends facing multilateral cooperation from your perspective, former president. Thank you very much. And I think actually it's a really, I think, an excellent note to move on and look to the future with. You've assessed, I think rightly so, that much of multilateral cooperation can and has been clouded by geopolitical rivalry, as you put it. So how, going forward, especially in starting with this session, how do we re-envision, or how can we envision multilateral cooperation to cut through that global rivalry and as you put it, re-find that a unity that can be human-centered going forward. So with that, I'm thank you all for your honest and frank answers. on your own global agendas and the key trends that are shaping international cooperation. Till now, I think for the next round, I'd like to shift to this opportunity of the Summit for Democracy coming up in December, hosted by US President Joe Biden. I'd like to start again with Eamon back at the EU. Eamon, could you name 2 or 3 concrete commitments that you'd like to see come out of the Democracy Summit?
Well, first of all, I very much welcome, and the European Union very much welcomes the initiative of President Biden and the United States administration to convene the Summit for Democracy. We've had some initial discussions with our United States friends, expressing our support for that, and indeed our enthusiasm for it and our willingness to participate in it. It's probably a bit soon for us to start nailing down specific commitments or specific outcomes that should come from it. I think, as a matter of courtesy, I think we'd like to leave the initiative on that perhaps to the hosts. And in any event, it's an issue that we have to explore more with our member states. But if I could maybe speak a little bit more broadly, and perhaps more from my experience as a practitioner of democracy, and I spent almost 30 years in the parliament of my own country, and before that working for civil society organizations, and maybe just to look at maybe 2 broad issues that I think need to be addressed. The first is what we, and the theme of this event today and your week is around partnership. And what is our understanding of partnership when we're talking about democracy? Because it seems to me that it needs to be bigger and it needs to be broader than purely governmental, than purely the partnership between states and with multilateral organizations. That, of course, is enormously important. And may I say in that context, that the United States re-engagement since the inauguration of President Biden with the multilateral organizations, in particular with the Human Rights Council and World Health Organization, I think is a great signal. Now, I know from what I know of the Summit for Democracy that it is intended to involve civil society and media and academia and private sector, and that's very welcomed. But I think it also needs not to be confined to the civil and political. Of course, issues like, free and fair elections, institutions, separation of powers, freedom of press, media, assembly, and so on. These, of course, are very, very important issues when we're talking about democracy. But we also need to recognize that democracy and human rights flies on 2 wings. One is the civil and political, and the other is the economic, social, and cultural. And President Sirleaf referred in particular to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I agree with her on that. One of the difficulties I think that we have in democratic countries, and one of the reasons why there is this exposure, if you like, of democracy, is the sense and the perception that in some democratic countries, the relevance of democracy is not always very clear. And particularly for people who are disadvantaged, workers losing well-paid jobs in old industrial towns, young people looking at the precarious nature of the employment contract, issues related to climate and technology and so on. So therefore, I think that we need to have, when we talk about partnership, we need to be talking about partnership which embraces the social, economic, cultural, and indeed the sustainable development goals. And when we drill that down to a national level, we need to be looking at models of social and economic partnership, which gives engagement to citizens beyond voting at elections every 4 or 5 years. The second aspect I think that we need to think about is innovation. Purpose of the Summit for Democracy, as I've seen it, is in part to talk about the renewal of politics. And inevitably, in that discussion, we will talk about the polarization of politics, the degree to which political discourse has become very coarsened, very angry. the impact in that context as well of technology and of social media. When I started in my political life, a political statement, a very short political statement was a full page. A moderately sized political statement was maybe 2 pages. These days, political statements have to fit into the number of characters that you can get into a tweet, and therefore the nuance that is required in political discourse isn't possible to be picked up. So we need to look at the space for deliberation in politics. The old Greek idea that you went down to the Acropolis and you heard all the arguments and then you made your political decision, is long gone. And even though it survived for a while, conventional media would present both sides or the multiple sides of an argument, that's increasingly disappearing. So therefore, I think we have to think about new ways for deliberation and engagement, and if necessary, compromise, as it is always part of the political. And I just want to offer maybe just one idea from my own country of Ireland, which, as an idea, a case of innovation type of thing we might be looking at. We addressed 2 very big social issues, which were very controversial in our country in recent years. One was abortion, and the other was same-sex marriage. And we managed to have that debate and indeed to have decisions made in referenda by very substantial majorities in favor of liberalizing our abortion laws, taking the ban on abortion out of our constitution, and first country in the world to approve same-sex marriage by popular vote. And the reason we did that was because we established a new structure for engagement. Initially, it was called the Constitutional Convention. Then it became the Citizens' Assembly. Its basic idea was that you select 100 citizens at random, put the question to them, give them the information, expose them to the arguments, and they come up with recommendations. And the interesting thing about that experiment was that not only did it produce recommendations that were eventually adopted by the Parliament and by referendum, but it actually won the confidence of the public, because people saw this. Here are people like themselves, selected like a jury, address a complex issue. I don't think it would have been possible for us to have that debate conducted in that kind of environment, and maybe with that kind of outcome, if we had confined it just to the more polarized and partisan political debates that take place in Parliament, or indeed these days that take place in the general media. So I think we need to be looking at new ways of developing our democracies.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Eamon, and also for speaking to your rich experience in the public life in Ireland. So to pull the main ideas out, the main commitments you'd like to see coming out of the summit, rethinking partnership beyond elections and empowering citizens on more of you mentioned the socioeconomic, cultural, also strategic goal dimensions, and empowering citizens in public life, in engagement in political life, in engaging in the partnership of co-creating democracy. And then the other main commitment you want to look for is space for deliberation, and for good reason. Thanks for bringing in the examples of the same-sex marriage and abortion citizen assemblies that were gathered and convened very successfully. These are excellent commitments that we are seeing shaping in different ways all across Europe and the world. Especially around some of these strategic development goals and issues like climate. And it's a very important, 2 very important commitments, I think, that we can carry forward in this conversation. And moving next to the US again, Under Secretary Zeya, from your perspective, also given these commitments in mind from Eamon, what do you think is needed to make the summit an actual resounding success, to meet those commitments?
Absolutely. Thank you for that core question, Maria, and also thank you to Eamon for his brilliant perspective. I would say for the United States, through the Summit for Democracy, President Biden aims to achieve 3 overarching goals. 1, to strengthen our democratic institutions. 2, to honestly confront challenges to democracy faced all over the world, which former President Johnson Sirleaf and Eamon have described so eloquently. And 3, and perhaps most importantly, to forge a common agenda to address threats to our shared values. Now, achieving these goals, as you said, requires the participants to make and fulfill concrete commitments in each of the summit's 3 areas of focus. First, defending against authoritarianism, which we see on the rise throughout the world, as our other panelists have described so eloquently. 2, elevating the fight against corruption, which in itself is a driver of the inequality, which Eamon pinpointed with such clarity as the counterpoint to the civil political rights that underpin democracies. And 3rd, protecting human rights in our own nations and abroad. So our approach is one that words must be matched by actions. We must strengthen the resilience of democratic institutions and processes to defend against resurgent authoritarian threats. We must counter corruption by enhancing transparency and accountability in order to strengthen public confidence in democracy and highlight one of its critical advantages. And we must advance respect for human rights to secure a more peaceful, prosperous, stable future and ensure that all citizens can benefit from democratic systems and hold their governments accountable. Now, I have to emphasize here, the summit will also be a success if we're able to elevate and strengthen the role of civil society. And I think this gets to the critical point that Eamon made as far as partnerships and moving beyond, the very traditional frame of government to government collaboration to bring in civil society as a meaningful stakeholder. In our view, an empowered, diverse, independent civil society is critical to strengthening democratic institutions, protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, combating corruption, and fostering stability and security. Civil society can also help ensure that all voices are heard, including those of women, girls, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI persons, and many others who can otherwise be marginalized by solely government-to-government channels. So we all have an interest, and I think a moral imperative, to protect civic space and empower civil society organizations. And we will seek to do that in the Summit for Democracy in 3 ways. First, we're encouraging all governments who may participate in the summit to collaborate with local and international civil society organizations as they develop their summit commitments. Second, we're encouraging governments who take part to commit to taking steps to broaden space for civic participation and to bolster civil society at home and abroad. And third, we're developing opportunities for civil society representatives to participate in the summit directly, so they're able to give voice to communities who may otherwise not be heard. Leading by example, this afternoon, I'm happy to be joining with colleagues from the White House and across the interagency a call with more than 500 civil society organizations and activists to seek their feedback and to engage in meaningful and constructive dialogue in anticipation of the December summit. So this just gives an overview, I think, of our overall approach on concrete commitments, as well as the integral participation of civil society in this effort.
Thank you, Undersecretary. It's a very comprehensive and very thoughtful plan for helping ensure that the summit can be a success. And it's great to hear that citizens and civil society are very much at the heart of that effort going forward. I'd like to turn next to the former President Sirleaf again. We've heard commitments, ideas from Eamon and a number of efforts and plans for ensuring that the summit can actually turn words into action, as the Undersecretary said. From your view, who do you think should have a seat at the table? We've heard that civil society will be included in the conversations. Who do you think should be there?
I believe the leaders of the democracies of the world will be invited and should be there. And I also believe that civil society, as mentioned before, have a definite role to play. Let me also say that this is an opportunity to right a wrong regarding women. Too often, women do not get the same equal opportunity to be a part of these events. And I'd like to go one step further to say commitments coming out of the summit must put emphasis on support for the ascendancy of women in leadership. You can't have 7% of corporate, leaders, not just women. You can't have 27% women represented in Congress, parliamentarians, and all of that. And so, but because that would take a specific commitment. I think we want to see a stronger commitment to a strong commitment to what has been required in COP26, and that is the fight against climate change. This is so important because today, many of the poorer and lower income countries have good biodiversities because they have not exploited their natural resources, unlike the richer nations that have done so over time. And we are now asked to contribute to ensuring a conservative environment. Now is the time to give back. And so a commitment to I think it's 10 billion or so at COP26 in November in Paris. I'd like to see this summit do something on that. And on a practical thing, the United States' own commitment to once again become the global leader that the world has known. That's something that's very hard to put, in a summit agenda because it's supposed to be that way. But I think we need to find a way so that what we see on television screens internationally every night says that we still need a stronger commitment to make sure that global leadership takes its rightful place as is done in the past. Those are my few comments, but everything that's been said, I think all the key points have been touched on, quite adequately. And I think those are the commitments, civil society, corruption, better leadership, more democracy, inclusive growth. Those are all the things that we all agree.
Thank you, former President. Also for the note to ensure that specific commitments are made, not just who in terms of which countries or civil society are invited, but also ensuring that there is equity in representation there, gender equity. And also for bringing the huge topical issues that strong democracies can tackle, such as climate, to the table and to the top of the agenda. We don't have much time for another round of questions from me because I want to save time for questions from our audience. So I want to just give all of you, our audience, a reminder. I see there are a lot of great questions already on the Slido, and I look forward to turning to those soon. Just one quick reminder, do pop in your questions or vote which questions you'd like to see answered first, and I'll be addressing those soon. Before we turn to the audience questions, I would like to ask Eamon one more question. We've already talked a lot about the commitments we want to see, the ways in which we can actually see through those commitments to actual strategy and action. And we've also heard who should be at the table and to be a part of this summit. I'd like to take the question back to the EU and ask you how do you think the summit can help overcome, or the EU overcome, its own difficulty in upholding strong value-driven positions in view of conflicting national interests abroad? It's a tough question.
Well, I love tough questions. Thank you very much, Maria. First of all, I think one of the great values of this summit is, I think, that, after a period of time where democracy has been on the defensive, I think this is an opportunity for democratic countries and those who are for democracy to line up and to work more closely together. So that's a positive. I think on the issue of promoting our values abroad, I'll make this point that the European Union doesn't shy away from promoting what are universal values. Sometimes people refer to them as European values. I don't. They're universal values that the European Union supports. And if you look, for example, just to give you one example of it, yesterday, the speech on behalf of the High Representative to the European Parliament dealing with the European Union's relations with China. And I just quote this to you because I think it summarizes the approach of the European Union to, this whole issue of values and interests. So the High Representative said, the European Union must continue to speak its mind, stand its ground, and push back in areas where there are fundamental disagreements with China, first and foremost on human rights. And we've been doing that, and give an example of it. The adoption, for example, last year of the global human rights sanctions regime, the decisions earlier this year to proceed with sanctioning officials from a number of countries, including Russia and China. I think on this issue, this balance, because there's always this question of, you're promoting your values, but then there are interests, and how do you get this balance right? I think that we have to recognize that interests are a reality. And in fact, if you think about it, one of the functions of democracy is to reconcile interests and to find the balances between conflicting interests, either within countries, within the European Union. We have quite an elaborate system now of making decisions on economic matters, on trade matters and so on, qualified majority voting and so on. And if you take the whole process of democracy right to the point, take any election in any country and look at what is on the agenda during that election, and you will find there are a lot more interests than there are values agendas. If you look at some of the exit polls from elections and where people are asked what influenced your vote, you'll find invariably interests feature very highly. So part of the functioning of democracy, and I think we have to understand this, that part of the functioning of democracy is about the reconciling of interests and about the reconciling of interests with the promotion of values. And also, I think, to understand that what was a value yesterday may be an interest today. In a very early stage of my parliamentary career, I remember the Kyoto conference took place on climate change. Climate change was very much on the values side of the ledger at that time. It's very firmly on the interests side these days. And when we're looking at, for example, the promotion of human rights and democracy and our work in the European Union, we tie it very closely to economic activity. All of our trade agreements have human rights clauses. The trade preferences we have with developing countries have requirements to meet certain human rights and democracy standards. We're developing a whole agenda on business and human rights, including the possibility of introducing European-wide legislation on due diligence for the supply chain. And again, to go back to the State of the Union address by President von der Leyen today, one of the standout, I think, quotations from that address was where she said, human rights are not for sale at any price. And that applies obviously to democracy as well. So your question, yes, is a hard question, and I understand what is driving it. About how do we get this right? How do we get promotion of values and the defense of interests? And I think that we have to think more in terms of these, not these being polar opposites, but actually getting them into alignment. And that when the European Union is speaking and doing its work, interests and the values that we have are part and parcel of that, and that we do it consistently, and that no matter how big or powerful the country is, that the values agenda is part of the discussion and part of the engagement, and we use our democratic processes to try and resolve the reconciling of interests.
Thank you, Eamon. It was a difficult question, and there are many more difficult questions to come. But thank you for helping us pivot towards some of these questions that have come in from the audience. So now I'd like to bring all the speakers back and start addressing some of these great questions that are coming in. I don't have time to ask all of these, but I'll try to follow those that have been upvoted and whatnot. So do keep engaging, and I'll bring the questions in. So first question is from Helfried Karl at the Innovation of Politics Institute. So the question is, democracies need democratic citizens to thrive. What can and will actors like the EU and US do to support democratic practice and innovation on their own soil and beyond? Perhaps we can start with Undersecretary Zeya here. Undersecretary, would you like to jump in here?
Certainly. And, I think this question picks up on a very important point in that, the United States, we recognize that no democracy is perfect, including the United States or other established democracies. So this is one of the reasons that we are urging summit participants to commit to measures that will strengthen democratic institutions and processes at home. And of course, as the host, we recognize we need to lead by example. So we are working intensively to develop our own domestic commitments, which we'll announce at the summit. And in parallel, US embassies and missions across the world are engaging with potential summit participants to identify domestic deliverables of their own. Now, some of the forms that these might take, obviously, it remains with the country's concern to define, and I absolutely support the points made earlier by Madam President about local and national ownership. But that said, I think there are a number of areas where we could see progress. For instance, governments could expand election security programs to combat electoral interference. They could commit to not shut down the internet, telecommunications services, social media, or messaging platforms. On the anti-corruption front, they can increase the transparency of property ownership to curtail the ability of corrupt actors to hide their wealth. Or in terms of combating hate and intolerance, they could appoint a national coordinator to combat anti-Semitism. These are just a few examples of strong domestically oriented measures. At the same time, we think it's vital for participating governments to commit to new internationally oriented measures as well. So some specific examples here. Governments can support reforms to the UN ECOSOC NGO accreditation process that will allow and not inhibit civil society participation in UN meetings. They can increase support to public interest media overseas, or they can limit export of surveillance software that can be misused by authoritarian actors. So these are just a few examples, illustrative examples, and by no means exhaustive. As I said, the United States is developing our international commitments as well, and we hope to partner with other countries and civil society actors on efforts to bolster independent media, to fight corruption, and to address the intersection of democracy and technology, which Eamon pointed to so eloquently before, among other priorities. So this is a team effort, absolutely, and we are working to deliver on both domestic and international commitments that we hope will be shared and translated into action with our governmental and civil society partners.
Thank you, Undersecretary. I would like to move on to the next question. We have a couple of interesting questions now from Anonymous is the top question. What is, for you, the lesson to learn from Afghanistan regarding democracy support and state building? And I'd like to ask at least two of you, if two of you could come in, perhaps we can start with Undersecretary. And I'd like to ask you to keep your answers nice and brief so we can run through all the questions. Undersecretary.
Certainly. I would say for me, one of the greatest lessons learned is democracy support is a long-term investment, and I would say even a generational commitment. I think we see all over the world transitions from authoritarianism, transitions from civil war are more often than not linear. They are often perilous, and they can also be deadly with respect to successive eruption of armed conflict, forced displacement of civilians, and resurgence of authoritarianism. But I also would say that the lesson of Afghanistan is we need to have an enduring commitment with respect to supporting the welfare and the rights of the Afghan people. And that certainly is the approach that the United States is taking in coordination with international partners to hold the Taliban accountable with respect to freedom of movement for the Afghan people, with respect to upholding human rights, particularly of women and girls and vulnerable groups, with respect to upholding its commitments on counterterrorism as well. So for me, the lesson is we need a sustained commitment. We need to also recognize the critical importance of local ownership. And I would also say that I think we should not conclude that the investments made by the United States and the international community were in vain. The Afghanistan of 2021 is certainly not the Afghanistan of 2001 with respect to the participation of women in society, with respect to historic gains in health and education. And I believe that it's vitally important that the international community sustain its commitment to the Afghan people in this new context.
Thank you, Undersecretary, for your frank response. I'd like to ask Eamon as well. Do you have any top lessons learned from Afghanistan in terms of democracy support or state building?
Well, I think the first lesson that we have to learn is that Afghanistan is still very much a crisis in progress. Mm-hmm. And that what we have to do, and very quickly, is to double down on ensuring that the 5 benchmarks that the European Union has set down for engagement with the Taliban and with the new regime in Afghanistan are fulfilled. And at the top of that list is, of course, the rights of women and the rights of girls. Mm. And I think that we cannot be thinking, or we should not allow ourselves be lulled into a situation of some kind of half measure on this. Saying that, yes, women can attend university, provided that the room is segregated and provided that a certain code of dress is, that is not my understanding of fulfilling the rights of women. And I think that there is a lot more that we need to see and hear from the Taliban to convince us that they are actually going to respect fully the rights of women, that the gains that were made in the last 20 years are not going to be lost, that human rights will be respected. And I think that, so far, I think what we are getting is we are getting soothing noises from the more polished performers of the Taliban appearing at press conferences. But the information that we are getting and that we are seeing through civil society, through reliable reports that we are getting are not confirming that. So I think on Afghanistan, I think before we start to sit back in the couch or sit back in the university forum to start reflecting on what are the longer term lessons, I think that we need to double down on the work that has to be done immediately, this week, today, this month, to ensure that the rights of women in particular and the rights of the people of Afghanistan are protected and vindicated.
Thank you both for both of your insights into the lessons we can draw from this experience. I'd like to zoom on to the next questions. The next one is from Jorn Fritzenkotter. He's asked, what can Europe, and I would add also the US, learn from Africa about democracy? And perhaps we can start actually with you, Eamon, and then we can move through Undersecretary and the former president.
Well, I think that is a great question because very often when I'm doing my work as the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, I'm very often met with the response, and sometimes from African countries and African interlocutors, that they do not want to be lectured to by Europe on issues relating to democracy. And I think that that's a very fair point to make. And I think it's a fair point to make, first of all, because I think that Europe needs to approach this issue with a great degree of humility, particularly when we reflect on what happened on the European continent in the 20th century. I think there is a great deal to be learned from Africa and the way in which democracy has developed, the challenges to democracy in Africa, the linkage that I talked about before between the civil and political side and the economic and social side, the sustainable development goals. We have a very good dialogue with the African Union. The African Charter on People and Human Rights, which is a very strong charter. I was greatly honoured to be asked to participate in the 40th anniversary of that charter recently, an event to market. I think there are a lot that can be, and I think that the approach that we need to take, and this is about partnership. I think that we need to approach these issues in a partnership way, so that we're learning from each other, and that we're also learning about the challenges and the contexts in which governments are operating, in which the political parties and the political system is operating, in which media have to operate, and in which civil society have to operate. And I think work much more in a partnership way where we're supporting. And we have a number of, I don't want to have a list of them here, of various programs that, for example, that the European Union is working on, both with the African Union and with individual African countries to work in partnership on those issues.
Thanks, Eamon. Actually, I instead of going through the tour of the US and then back to former President Sirleaf, I think I'll start with former President Sirleaf. Would you like to come in on this? And from your perspective, what do you think Europe can learn from Africa about democracy?
Let me say what Eamon said and sort of agree with him about equality in partnership. I think we need to see more of that. And that would lead to a respect for national priorities. There's so many times when, partners would come with preconceived ideas about what is good, in the country, what a priority should be. So I just think that respecting priorities determined by the people themselves, and that determination can come to ensure that it comes from the voices of the people. I believe you can also learn that Africa can have a common voice and a common effort on specific global issues. And I recall with COVID-19 and the thing about the special drawing rights, where Africa was requesting special drawing rights to be able to meet the debt overhang that would come from the effect of COVID-19, that we had all the African institutions come together with one word. Also, again, COVID-19 experience with COVAX, and the fact it was the African private sector coming together with the public sector to be able to do a lot of self-effort and to be able to carry its case to the global environment, to ensure that Africa needs were given the right attention. So I believe those are things that we can learn. I think our own adherence to our culture is something that is increasingly appreciated, and how we carry that in our traditional way is something that we like to see appreciated and respected by others.
Thank you both. I'd like to move on to the next question again. And this one is from Ruth from the European Partnership for Democracy. Ruth asks, what is the value of a democracy summit when global players are still unable to reverse autocratization in countries like Hong Kong and Belarus? Perhaps we'll start with the Undersecretary, Zeya. Undersecretary.
I would say the value of the coming together is precisely the trends that the questioner identified. Eamon mentioned with respect to China, I think since the inception of the Biden-Harris administration, we've seen a stronger and more action-oriented collaboration between the United States and Europe with respect to responding to grave violations of human rights in China. And we've seen real solidarity with respect to the strangling of democracy in Hong Kong, and concrete consequences in the form of sanctions and statements to denounce these efforts. Because the challenges are so immense, the situation with respect to Belarus, we have now passed the 1-year anniversary of this unprecedented public outpouring against overwhelming odds and dangers to demand democracy and free and fair elections. And I think here too, we've seen vitally important solidarity between the US and Europe, but we need to see greater international solidarity on these questions at home, because it is a democracy agenda at home and abroad, where our ability to stand up and speak for the rights of others and speak out against the suppression of the rights of others, and to use international instruments and multilateral fora to this end. I think it is only through coming together that we can strengthen those efforts and make greater progress than we could independently, rather than taking, let's say, a more resigned approach that the challenges are simply too immense to address. I do see this as a centering principle within the President Biden's overall foreign policy approach, where he and Secretary Blinken have spoken, quite eloquently and determinedly about their ambition to center US foreign policy rights foreign policy in human rights and our shared democratic values. And to an earlier point that Eamon made, I think we also need to discard a mindset of a conflict between values and interests, and recognize that the alignment and intersection is what we're seeking to pursue. I think through initiatives like the Summit for Democracy, but other vitally important efforts by the European Union, by our partners in Africa, and certainly, just to address the earlier question with respect to what we have to learn from Africa, we certainly expect there to be strong representation at the Summit for Democracies. And in my own personal journey, I draw immense inspiration by the example of Madam President and the role that Liberian women had in ending a civil war and putting a country recovering from devastating conflict on a path to democracy that continues to this day.
You're here. Thank you, Undersecretary. And perhaps to your response to the question about the value of the summit in terms of up against countries being unable to reverse autocratization. Eamon, do you have anything to add to the Undersecretary's comments in terms of what value a summit like this could actually hold in this respect?
I think the value of it, and I'm really happy that it is happening, is that there is a massive global struggle that we're engaged in for democracy, for the universal values of human rights. There's been enormous pushback against them. And therefore, I think it behoves countries, regions who are for democracy, who are for human rights, to align with each other. And I think that is I think it is great that we are doing that. Let me say, by the way, that the European Union, during the last US administration, we did have a good engagement with the United States, particularly with the State Department. But of course, there was always a degree of uncertainty about the political decisions that might come from time to time from the top. So therefore, I think getting an alignment which is consistent, where we all know where we are, I think that's important. But I also think it needs to go beyond the governmental. And therefore, I think civil society organizations, those who are in favor of democracy, those who want to promote democracy, there is no simple answer. If you take Belarus, Afghanistan is the top of our agenda, and it's on the top of the news today. This time last year, it was Belarus. And I think that we have to continue with the pursuit of democracy in Belarus. The television cameras and the microphones may have moved away from it now, but we have to continue to persist with that. There are no simple, easy solutions. It would be great if statements from the United States President or the President of the European Council or the European Commission could resolve authoritarianism in Belarus. It's going to take a greater degree of work and a greater degree of cooperation between countries, civil society organizations, and so on. And I think that's where we are right now, is kind of realigning ourselves, getting ourselves into shape for what will be, I think, long and difficult struggles to achieve democracy and human rights in different parts of the world. And we referenced some of the countries earlier during the discussion. So I think this is very positive that we're at this point that that the summit will take place in December. That we'll all contribute to it, and that we'll continue to work together, particularly in the multilateral organizations in the period ahead.
Thank you, Eamon. It sounds as if the summit in this regard can play a very key step in helping support these difficult situations and conversations going forward. I'd like to move on to the next question. We have about 5 minutes left, so not much time, but this is a very important question. And I'd like to start with Madam President Sirleaf. In your view, this is a question from Adeline Brian from Lie Detectors. She's asked, what role should education and key skills like media literacy play in fighting threats to our democracies? And this is in particular interest I'd like to ask you as a former president. What do you think the role of education should be in helping bolster our democracies?
Education is key, not only for democracy, but for any aspect of national development. We have known the effect after so many years of conflict, when young people had no opportunity to go to school, that this has so affected our national capacity to be able to implement our development agenda, that unless we had to go abroad and try to get repatriation of some of our key intellectuals to come back to be able to do so. And so to have a national capacity that has an agenda that's as aggressive as our African countries' agendas are, given that we're trying to lift ourselves out of poverty, one has to start with human resource development. Many times we find ourselves drifted to other priorities. I certainly did, because when you have an infrastructure deficit, and you're trying to make sure you deliver basic electricity and water to people, you tend to undermine education, because education is not a quick fix. Education is a long, continuing, consistent endeavor to build the institutions that do the training, to get people back into school, to ensure that young people like girls stay in school in a country that has poverty throughout the society. But one has to agree that that is the key. And we find in some of our countries that have been smart in putting education, on the front line of their agenda, that those countries have fared much better in being able to implement their agenda. And so for many of us, we need to do more. We need to commit our own natural resources to education. And we need to keep those budgetary education growing and consistent until we get more of our people. And in those cases, another form of education, of course, is technical education. For many of our people who've not had the opportunity of school, we need to do more for technical education to give them a skill so that they are able to be able to take care of their own needs. So today, I get my answer is education, that all of our countries make it the number one on the agenda. That is the answer for success.
Thank you, Madam President. And with a couple of short minutes to go, I would like to thank also our audience for all the great questions. I think this has been a wonderful debate, and I'd like to thank wholeheartedly our speakers, each one of you. Thank you for taking the time and for your honest and frank responses. It's been a delight to host this conversation. Thank you. And I would also like to thank the organizers for pulling this together. This has, I think, been a wonderful conversation that we've gone all over the place in very important ways to essentially look at the role of partnership and the role of us in each of our leadership ways in supporting democracy going forward. And it's a great way to mark this International Democracy Day. For all of you, please do tune in tomorrow and Friday. The continuation of the conference includes several very interesting debates. Tomorrow, there's a debate on human rights and international partnerships. There's also another conversation on best practices for international democratization initiatives, and a third on global partnerships for supporting democracy online. And then on Friday, the conference will close with a conversation on supporting democracy in Europe and the European neighborhood. So please do tune in, and please keep the conversation going. And again, thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.